So it's been a little under 24 hours since The Quiet Man was released, and a lot of people seem to have a negative opinion on it. A lot of people are on the fence of whether to get it or not, and most people who don't really care probably just watch a playthrough on YouTube. The game itself was very interesting. At E3, it was shown as this live action episode, well, this live action game, and we never saw anything of it for around about 4 or 5 months afterwards. And I feel when we saw like the presentation of it, everybody was like, "Oh, this is an alpha." Like the graphics didn't look good, the combat looked clunky, and we were like, "Hey, it'll probably get better. This looks vaguely interesting, playing as a deaf protagonist." the The problem is that the game really isn't a particularly interesting game. It's experimental. Not many games out there have allowed you to play as a deaf protagonist and do the sort of things you do in this game, where you piece together the story and the entire game is silent. The problem is, though, is that it isn't an interesting concept after about 3 minutes, because the idea of the game relies on you being deaf and every cutscene basically being without sound, and you piece together the story through the images and the actions of the characters shown. And that's my dog running up the stairs. I bet you stink of tuna now, don't you? Yeah. But the entire game itself has no sound whatsoever, and it's a little annoying. This is because at numerous points in the game, sign language is shown and your character speaks, and I feel like those should be things that are given subtitles at least, because it says that you experience the world as your character does, but this isn't exactly true. I mean, if my character's speaking or reading sign language, then, I mean, at the end of the day, shouldn't I have some insight into how that is with subtitles? I mean, I'm not saying the entire game needs to be subtitled, it's just that it would have been interesting just for clarity. Like, if my character's speaking, surely I should know as the player who's experiencing this character what's going on. So I've written down a few more bullet points here. I never script my stuff because I hate scripting. One of the problems people will have with the game is, from the start, aside from the slightly clunky combat, is the controls are never explained to you. You are just thrown into the game and you just push buttons. There is no real skill involved with the game itself. You have your standard square attack to perform a basic melee attack, which can be comboed. Triangle is like a heavy finishing move sort of thing, which you can add into your squares, a lot like the Yakuza games. And circle, from what I understand, is a grapple attack, which I never used whatsoever. And X is your dodge button. And basically, if somebody runs up to you, you push X and you dodge. And I don't entirely understand how it works, but if you dodge and you push a button at a particular time, you seem to do some sort of almost instant kill counter. So the combat isn't exactly as deep as I would have hoped. And just by watching it, like, what you have to understand is the enemy variety type in this game is next to nothing. You literally see characters and you identify them by their strengths in terms of colors. So you have, like, at the start of the first half of the game, you have these green guys, and you're like, oh, they'll punch you, and they go down in like maybe 6 hits. They're no problem whatsoever. Then you encounter this guy who was wearing yellow, and I was like, oh, this is a mini boss. What I didn't understand was that this same guy seems to appear 18 times throughout the game. I mean, everybody does. The character models are lacking so much. There's like 7 character models in the game. Then you have like these red guys who are they just hit harder and they dodge and block more. And it's fun to fight the smaller characters, like the mooks, the generic enemies, because there is some level of challenge there. The problem comes when you're fighting bosses, because what they've done with bosses was that it's a lot like Arkham Asylum combat, where the basic enemy types are fairly fun to fight against in the grand scheme of things, but when it comes to bosses, that combat system doesn't translate over well. So when you fight bosses, there's, like, off the top of my head, like 3 or 4 bosses in the game. All of them involve you going to get hit, dodging, and then performing a counterattack. And unless you, for some reason, are able to score a hit on them, which I was only able to do when they stood up. And this is how my boss fights went for the most part. I would find the boss. He was either blocking or dodging my blows, so I would just stand there like an idiot and wait for him to hit me. I'd eventually counter him. And when he falls to the floor, when he gets up, there's a very brief period where you can hit them. And what I would do was just spam square to hit them, and then triangle when they're near a wall. And if you push triangle near any opponent in the game when they're near a wall, you hit them into the wall. And when they hit into a wall, they fall to their knees, and you can push square to punch them in the face, and they stand back up, and you can then hit triangle again. And I defeated all the bosses in the game by doing this tactic just to skip the tedium of waiting to be hit. And a quick note, another thing that's never mentioned, is you push L2 and you go into like this hyper-focus punching. I don't know, you just go like into like a super mode. It would be nice to have known that throughout the game. And that doesn't work on bosses either, by the way, at least from my experience. The graphics are what you see. They're very basic. It looks like something for most people would say from 2008. Graphics are not the most important part of a game, but going from like real life looking graphic, obviously real actors and stuff, to what you have here, it's like playing a game on ultra and then going to the lowest settings. They don't look great, and the faces especially don't look amazing. The animations when you're fighting more or less look okay. They look pretty decent for the most part, but the graphics themselves are very poor. The EA on most of the characters looks like somebody just put a wig, like a big block on their head, basically. The game also experiences a wealth of bugs and crashes. I was on PS4, and the installation file, I believe, was 17 gigabytes for the entire game. So I installed that, and I was like, let's play. I got to the end of chapter 1, and the game crashed, and it was showing me a street. I basically had to walk down the street in the previous section and watch a cutscene. And they was just showing me a camera of the street. And I was like, oh, okay, this is a weird loading screen. And it wasn't a loading screen. The game had just not loaded the next segment. So there was then a patch, an optional patch for the PS4, which I downloaded then, which took way too long. And that skipped this issue. That was like an extra 14 gigabytes or something. I don't know if that was like, if the first one added the first part of the game and the second one added the second part. I don't see why it would be the optional otherwise. But basically, the game experienced, for me, a lot of bugs, even after installing both of those. Immediately after, I'll probably show it on screen now if I remember, the guy, there was this cutscene, and this lady was about to sing, and the game just froze. I was like, oh, it's like one of those games where the game freezes briefly, and then it introduces like the gameplay. You've seen it in some games before. Can't name off from the top of my head, however. And then you play the game. However, it was just a freeze. And 3 minutes later, well, not even 3 minutes later, 30 seconds later, I was like, So I restarted it anyway. Now, I played relatively bug-free then, for the most part, up until, I think it was just before the final boss. You had to clear this room of ridiculously annoying enemies who just come after you in waves upon waves, and if they hit you with their weapon, it nearly kills you. So this took me about 4 or 5 attempts, the only time in the game I had difficulty. And defeat the boss, I was like, oh man, that took way too long. And I went to the door, and I was like, alright, there's the loading screen, and I was just waiting, and this will probably be on screen now, and then this happened. And I was like, oh, amazing, great. And I was like, okay, well, at least I've done that section. So I just clicked continue playing, and lo and behold, despite that, I had to do the entire chapter again. And when I remember crashing on the end of chapter 102, whatever it was, and I wanted to restart just in case, it restarted at the beginning of the chapter. So it's like, you could play the chapters themselves, or let's say 30 minutes long, if that, but if they crash, you got to do them all again. That's 30 minutes you've got to sit through cutscenes on again, you've got to do all the combat again, and it's not super interesting when you realize that all the cutscenes that you're looking at, you you don't understand what's going on. I mean, yeah, the idea is to piece together different parts of the game and to understand and go, oh, this is part of the story, but it's not as fun as it sounds. It's like you can do this with anything. Literally, if you sit down and you watch a movie and you just mute it and you have some strange sound effect appearing every 20 or so seconds, that is the experience you get. And I mean, I'm not deaf, but I don't feel that really portrays a deaf person. I feel like, especially in the confines of the game, since the character can clearly understand what's going on, I feel like it's a bit silly, really. You feel like some information should have been given to you, which obviously I touched upon earlier. Your best bet is that if you still are interested in the game, wait for it to drop in price. It probably isn't worth £10 or 14 or something dollars. You're probably better off just waiting. There is no real incentive to buy the game right now, even when you consider the fact that when you beat the game, there is this small cutscene which says, oh, the truth is revealed or something like that in this amount of time, and you realize that what they're adding is like a free patch that gives voice acting. I believe like it actually gives the voices of the characters, so you can understand the story, and maybe there's something extra after the credits. I'm not even so sure if I have an incentive to do this now, mainly because I really kind of didn't enjoy playing in the first part. So that might be another reason why you want to wait. Anyway, I don't really understand reviews when they give scores like 6 out of 10. I don't really understand that. So I'd rate this game 66 out of 300. It's not the greatest game going.